To cover the New England boss, Phil Buccola. I'm going to take a little turn in this thing eventually and talk about this guy, Nicola Gentile. Just to give you a heads, I have to do it in order to establish something else. But I would take what Gentile says with a big, big grain of salt. So, continuing on, Buccola was born in 1886. He died in 1987 at 101 years old. He came up to the leadership of the Boston Mafia during Prohibition. He arrived in the U.S. from Sicily about 1920. By 1932, after a battle with the Guston gang, a bunch of deadly Irish gangsters, he took control of the mob and brought Joe Lombardo with him as a second in command. Buccola was a low-profile guy. He kept a low-profile organization. Everything was done quietly. He retired back to Italy in 1954 and handed his organization over to Raymond Patrick, who then merged Boston and Providence as one. Buccola died, as I said, natural cause in 1987. He probably became boss at the death of this guy, Gaspar Masini, in 1924. Masini was an early organizer of the New England branch of the American Mafia. At the same time, this is roughly 1916, Frank Morelli and his brothers were down in Providence and they were organizing the Mafia down there. The two groups merged, as I said, under Buccola during the Prohibition, and then Patriarca took it a step further. However, it's not all that certain that Messina, according to a lot of people, I'm giving you both sides of the coin here, that Messina died that year. That's the common knowledge. He died, and so the other guy took over. Here we go with Nicola Gentile, a Sicilian-born mafioso. He worked in New York in the 1920s and 30s. He arrived in the U.S. at age 18 in 1903, and he wandered around Pennsylvania, Ohio, Missouri, and eventually, as I say, landed in New York, worked with the Mafia. This is around 1905, 1910. His supporters of his story says, well, that's the reason you never heard of him. He was bouncing all over the place in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Missouri, and that's why you don't know about him. Uh, Not me, but a lot of people don't know about him. He was a mediator, according to his own legend. He mediated disputes between the Morello Lupo clan, the Aquila family, Chicago. This is the thing I'm having a hard time. He said he mediated disputes between Chicago and L.A. and New York, which I just don't believe. I mean, Chicago had, my God, New York had more than enough mediators. They didn't need this guy. Paul Rica was some kind of a genius. Frank Nitti was a great mediator. Um, why would they need this? Anyway, he said he was friends with the Pittsburgh bosses, Conti, Bazzano, the Cleveland bosses, Leonardo, Milano, and it goes on and on. He says he served as a Capitologene and as well as a counselor for the Pittsburgh mob and as a temporary boss of Kansas City. In 1937, he was facing narcotics charges. That much I know is true. On a federal arrest in New Orleans, and he fled to Sicily. That's also true. Um, According to him, anyway, when he returned to Sicily, he was made remarkably the boss of the Costa Nostra over there. I don't know. Seems odd to me. Um, that you would leave, have virtually no dealings in Sicily, you come back and they make you the boss. I don't know. I looked. There's no mention of him in Pittsburgh, Kansas City. Um, I just have doubts here. So after World War II, Luciano was deported to Italy, and U.S. narcotics enforcement. This is true because I've seen the file. They believe that Gentile and Luciano worked on some developing a narcotics route from close in Asia into France, into Italy, and then over to the U.S. That's probable. In or about 1939 in Sicily, Gentile says he actually completed a manuscript about his mafia experiences. So this is the question. I mean, why would he do that if he's the boss of the mafia? What? It makes no sense. I mean, he's dealing on a level with Luciano. He's involved in narcotics trafficking. So he says he wrote this manuscript. He then says he set the manuscript aside and he returned to it in 1963. How many years is that? And then with the help of, I have to tell you, much noted very respected Italian journalist, Felician Tellini. He says he finished his memoirs that Cittadini was writing. So, I have a lot of respect for Felice Cilenti, Chilanti. He stood up to the fascists, he stood up to Mussolini, he stood up to the Nazis. He's a brave guy. He was a hell of a writer. He put out almost 200 novels. What is known about him is that a lot of these novels he put out, these short stories and novels and so forth, were, an inch away from the truth. In other words, he fictionalized an awful lot of truth. I wonder if, because the manuscript exists, in English, it's called The Honor Society. And it describes the mafia in detail. I don't read Italian, and I haven't been able to find an English copy of it. But I'm wondering if Mr. Shenlanti, the journalist, used newspapers, compounded all his stuff, and then just went out and found this guy Gentile and said, hey, put your stamp on this, and we'll say it's the real thing. The book never went for sale in the U.S. It was sold in Europe, which is odd. So anyway, the FBI, and this is a fact, the FBI used Gentile's information to corroborate Joe Valachi's testimony in 1963, and in turn, Valachi, not realizing they had used the book to vouch his testimony, he vouched for the book's accuracy. And I'm sure it was accurate. In the United States, we became Mafia Savvy. After Valachi, we got an understanding of what structures are, what the positions were in the mafia. But in Italy, especially in Sicily, it wasn't a big secret. I mean, people knew there's this family, that family, this guy's in charge of that. So it would have been easy for a local journalist to build this structure and write about it. According to Gentile, the mafia sentenced him to death, but then they didn't kill him. Figure that one out. His final days apparently were awful. He was poverty-stricken. He just got by the goodwill of friends until he died in 1966 at age 81. According to the reason I'm bringing you here is according to Gentile, Masini, we were talking about him, the boss in New England, briefly served as the American Mafia boss of bosses about 1930. I don't think that's true, but if it is true, it fits in the timeline of Buccola becoming the acting boss of New England. So Buccola was born in Palermo. He arrived in the U.S. in the 1920s. He worked for a time as a fight promoter. He was a good fight promoter. He was actually well known, very successful at it. He was also a fight manager. On the side, he was running a Sicilian gang in East Boston and basically taking advantage of his own people, protection rackets, that sort of thing. He rose up the ranks of the Boston's Sicilian underworld because he was educated, apparently, and he had strong links to Palermo. So he had backing from Italy if he needed it. But what empowered him was his willingness to work with other criminals, other ethnic groups. He didn't care. It was unknown to the Italians over in Italy. They did, what are you doing? But he had a good point. The Irish had inroads into Prohibition was on. They had inroads into alcohol. There was Charles King Solomon, a Jewish bootlegger who ran a vast empire. They needed him, so he worked with Solomon. Unfortunately, he ended up killing Solomon in 1933, or he gave the order to kill him. But the point is, he worked well with other mobs. As far as anyone knows, Joe Lombardo served as his underboss, Buccola's underboss. I say that because there's a whole school of thoughts. Well, Lombardo was actually running things. Lombardo was running a little ethnic group inside the mafia, and blah blah blah. I don't know, but he was the underboss. That much we know. So Buccola retired. He owned huge estates in Sicily. He retired in 1954, and he turned the mafia, Providence and Boston, over to Raymond Patrick. Patrick was a Providence guy, but he moved back and forth between Massachusetts cities just north of Providence. And Buccola left, but he kept his hands on things. He was watching things. He had this massive chicken farm outside Palermo, but he taught Raymond Patrick the ropes. Again, he died at age 101, 1987. Not really all that long ago. Patrick ran his group out of Providence. He was happy there, but he assigned Frank Kuchahari, the Cheeseman. He was a cheese importer by trade to run the Boston branch. The Cheeseman had dealings in Europe, and the narcotics people were watching him, and he had contacts in Europe with Lucky Luciano and in New York with Vito Genovese. The narcotics people believe he was building some sort of narcotics. It's not clear. Somewhere in Montreal, it never came together completely. On January 24, 1976, he was 79 years old. The Cheeseman shot his wife. Her name was Santa. They shot her to death in a fit of apparently anger. Um, no one knows why exactly. He killed her, and then he killed himself. They had an apartment in Belmont, Mass. They found his wife upstairs on the second floor in the bedroom of their apartment. She'd been shot in the head at very close range. Then he was found on the floor nearby. He was dressed in his pajamas. He had shot himself in the mouth and it lodged in his brain. Um, but he somehow managed to fire the gun twice. I no idea how that's possible. But I guess his Frank Nitti uh, fired his gun 3 times before he ended up murdering himself. So.